When Voldemort dies in the films, he disintegrates into thousands of pieces and blows away in the wind. And when he dies in the books, his body falls with a mundane finality, revealing something far more fitting. In the end, there is nothing grand or mythic about his death at all. He simply dies. But in the end, neither depiction of his death answers the real question. His body might fall or crumble, but that tells us nothing about what truly became of him. Not the man, not the flesh, but the part he tried hardest to protect. The part he mutilated in his quest for immortality, his soul. And today we're going to be unpacking this further and taking a closer look at what may have happened to the most mutilated soul in wizarding history. Let's dive into it. Hey everyone, welcome to another installment of Harry Potter Theory. Now, this is certainly an interesting topic to tackle, because most people just sort of accept that Voldemort dies and that's it. There's even an underlying irony that Voldemort, in the books at least, dies a mortal death, simply collapsing on the floor. But if you really think about it, no actions are without their consequences, especially when you're one of the darkest wizards of all time that has made a habit out of experimenting with the worst kinds of dark magic imaginable. And in a magical world, dying doesn't mean you're exempt from facing the consequences of your actions. Dying isn't a get-out-of-jail-free card. You still murdered countless people and split your soul into a bunch of pieces. And that means, that's right, you're going to have to face that eventually, even in death. The line between the living and the dead is unquestionably a blurry one in Harry Potter. This is reinforced by the prevalence of beings that skirt these two planes of existence. Ghosts and Dementors are some of the first that come to mind. And in the case of Voldemort, his fate sits at a strange intersection between mortality, metaphysics, and magical lore, an ending that is neither life, nor death, nor anything we would recognize as peace. And with these blurred lines, the topic of death, which is also a key thematic element in Harry Potter, becomes even more alluring. In fact, one of the main messages of the Harry Potter books is that death is not absolute. It's also reinforced that it's not anything we should be worrying about. We're continually reminded that death is simply a part of life, and that rather than obsessing over it, we should instead shift our focus on seeking love and friendship, enjoying the time that we do have. But the lesson the books teach surrounding the inevitability of death is one that never quite resonated with our immortality-obsessed antagonist. Rather than embrace life at its own pace, Voldemort devised all sorts of plans to achieve the ever-elusive goal of immortality. But understanding Voldemort's fate requires us to understand the soul not just as a metaphor, but also as a concrete magical component. The existence of a soul is a somewhat abstract concept, which means it's hard to define. However, the generally accepted concept of a soul is that it's a kind of immaterial spiritual essence, an actuating cause of an individual's life. It's what makes us tick, and it certainly has no scientific explanation. It's the soul that Dementors feed on. It's pieces of soul that Voldemort imparts into objects, and it's the soul that Avada Kedavra purportedly rips out of the body. The soul is what keeps our corporeal form earthbound, and that's why it plays a significant role in the conversation surrounding the wizarding afterlife. And in pursuit of immortality, Voldemort repeatedly carved pieces of that very soul away. Every major step in his rise came with a cost, not to his body, but to the thing meant to survive death. Killing is the catalyst that tears the soul, and Voldemort committed his first murder as a teenager. That act alone fractured him, but he didn't stop there. Each Horcrux required another killing, and Voldemort was more than willing to supply the bodies. And the damage didn't end with murder. He experimented with Horcrux creation, soul magic that only one wizard before him had successfully performed. He forced pieces of his essence into objects never meant to carry such a burden, stretching what remained of himself thinner and thinner. And even his resurrection ritual in the graveyard, which used blood, bone, and flesh to drag his soul back into a corporeal form, further destabilized whatever integrity it had left. Each time he tore his soul apart, the fragment left behind became weaker, smaller, and more malformed. And by the time of the Battle of Hogwarts, Voldemort wasn't a man with a damaged soul. He was a damaged soul wearing the shape of a man. Harry Potter very much perpetuates the idea that ultimately the physical body is merely a shell, a vessel that merely transports the vital life force within. And because the soul is immaterial, it exists forever. You can exist without your soul, as long as your brain and heart are still working, but you'll have no sense of self anymore, no memory, no anything. There's no chance at all of recovery. You'll just exist as an empty shell, and your soul is gone forever, lost. And this is what makes soul magic the most forbidden branch of the dark arts. The soul is not meant to be touched. It's the core of a wizard's identity, the seat of memory, conscience, and continuity. When the soul is whole, death sorts the pieces out in a predictable way. The soul departs, and whatever comes next, be it an afterlife, another plane, or some great cosmic mystery, is entered intact. And unless you live a particularly cursed existence like Voldemort, then the soul won't be affected by death and the subsequent exit from the mortal realm. In fact, it seems as though, in most cases, quite the opposite happens, with the soul becoming vitalized or purified and reverting the individual back to their prime state. This is reinforced through Harry's interaction with the souls of his loved ones in the Forbidden Forest. Sirius was tall and handsome, and younger by far than Harry had seen him in life. He loped with an easy grace, his hands in his pockets and a grin on his face. Lupin was younger too, and much less shabby, and his hair was thicker and darker. He looked happy to be back in this familiar place, a scene of so many adolescent wanderings. In the case of Voldemort, however, he wasn't so lucky. This is shown through Harry's interaction with the broken remnant he encounters in King's Cross, a moment that finally reveals the true state of Voldemort's soul. Harry turned slowly on the spot, and his surroundings seemed to invent themselves before his eyes. He had spotted the thing that was making the noises. It had the form of a small, naked child curled on the ground, its skin raw and rough, flayed-looking, and it lay shuddering under a seat where it had been left, unwanted, stuffed out of sight, struggling for breath. Though many interpreted the child on the floor of King's Cross to be representative of the soul fragment expelled from Harry's body, it turns out it was actually representative of the current state of Voldemort's soul. What exactly was the mutilated, baby-like creature Harry saw at King's Cross in Chapter 35 of Hallows? I've been asked this a lot. It is the last piece of soul Voldemort possesses. The pathetic, whimpering creature Harry encounters isn't a vision or a metaphor. It isn't a hallucination brought on by near death. It is the literal condition of Voldemort's soul, stripped, wounded, and permanently deformed by the choices he made. In that moment, Rowling shows us exactly what remains of the Dark Lord when everything else is gone. Not power, not grandeur, not immortality, just suffering, frailty, and the consequences of a lifetime spent tearing himself apart. And where was Harry exactly when he encountered this highly damaged piece of Voldemort's soul? Well, limbo, of course. It looked like King's Cross, but I promise you it wasn't. Limbo in many religions can be described as the border place between heaven and hell, a place where lost souls go before moving on to the afterlife. It's a place where one is neither dead nor alive, a place that's often perceived as a forgotten or ignored place. Many different religions and cultures view limbo differently. However, one aspect of limbo is consistent across all of them. It's not somewhere that you want to be. Most outline that limbo is the place that a recently deceased person can make a choice, move on to the afterlife, or return to the world as a ghost, which is consistent with Harry Potter. But Rowling adds something darker. Limbo is also a place where a soul can be trapped if it is too damaged to move on. This is the crossroads Voldemort reaches, a liminal state where the normal machinery of death no longer works because the soul is too broken to function. This is why Voldemort's soul fragment doesn't move, doesn't speak, and doesn't grow. It's not that it's waiting, it's that it can't do anything else. Most souls arrive in this threshold state intact enough to choose their next step. Voldemort's, however, arrives so broken that the normal rules of death simply cannot apply to him. The scene at King's Cross is not just a symbolic representation of his downfall, it is the only moment in the series where we are shown, directly and without metaphor, what happens to a soul mutilated far beyond what the human condition was designed to endure. This is why Dumbledore calls soul splitting the supreme act of evil, not just because it kills, but because it unravels the very self. Voldemort's death wasn't peaceful, and it wasn't just final. It was metaphysical collapse. He had nothing left intact to carry on. For most witches and wizards, what comes after death is guided by choice, a fork in the road where a whole soul can either move on or remain behind as a ghost. But Voldemort never reaches that fork. His soul is so damaged, so incomplete, that the very processes that govern death can't function the way they're meant to. His fragment in limbo doesn't wait, and doesn't decide. It simply exists in a state where decision is impossible. And this is where we need to zoom out and look at what death normally looks like in the wizarding world, because only by understanding what should have happened can we understand just how wrong Voldemort's fate really was. In most cases, death in the wizarding world is not an end, but a transition. A soul freed from its body continues to exist somewhere else. And in most cases, a wizard's soul chooses whether to remain as a ghost or move on. Nearly Headless Nick explains that ghosts are not trapped souls, but deliberate impressions made by wizards who fear death and cling to the world. This requires a soul stable enough to make a decision at the moment of passing. Lily and James moved on, Sirius passed beyond the veil without resistance, even Nick, who feared death too much to leave, had enough coherence to choose a half-life. All of this depends on the soul being whole. But what happens to a soul too damaged to transition? What happens when the very mechanism that allows a wizard to move on, the continuity of self, has been destroyed? This is the crossroads Voldemort ultimately reaches. Death cannot work properly on a soul that has been shattered. His soul wasn't coherent enough to imprint anything. He didn't pass on, he didn't remain, he simply broke. And that's precisely why Voldemort's fate is one of, well, actually, the most horrifying in the entire series. Because whether he disintegrated into 1,000 pieces or merely collapsed to the floor, it doesn't really matter. The physical spectacle of his end is irrelevant. What matters is that, at the moment of death, Voldemort had nothing left intact to carry him anywhere. No stable consciousness, no continuity of self, no full soul to make a choice or experience release. His body died like everyone else's, but his soul remained trapped in the wreckage he created. He feared death above all else. He saw it as a weakness, something to be conquered, but by trying to defeat it, he destroyed the one part of himself that could have endured it. In the end, Voldemort didn't just die, he was tormented for all of eternity. Lovely. But before we wrap up, there's one more interpretation worth considering. One that isn't explicitly confirmed in canon, but many fans find strangely poetic. It's the idea that Voldemort didn't just suffer because his soul was damaged. He suffered because every destroyed Horcrux magnified that damage back onto what remained of him. In this interpretation, each Horcrux Voldemort created didn't just hold a fragment of his soul, it held the trauma of the act that tore it loose. A magical scar. Horcruxes aren't simply containers, they're wounds. And when a wound like that is destroyed, it doesn't quietly disappear. It snaps shut violently. Canon gives us hints that Horcrux destruction is not a gentle process. The diary erupts as if something alive is being killed. The ring carries a deadly curse. The locket screams. The cup melts and writhes. The diadem releases a dark, corrupted essence. Each one dies as though something is being forcibly ripped out of it. According to this theory, the violent destruction of each Horcrux sends a kind of metaphysical recoil back into the last surviving fragment of Voldemort's soul, weakening it further every time. By the end of the Battle of Hogwarts, all of those violent echoes have collapsed into a single remnant. A remnant far too small, far too wounded, and far too overwhelmed to withstand even the smallest shock. This would explain why the creature Harry sees at King's Cross looks the way it does. Not merely mutilated, but overloaded with every wound Voldemort ever inflicted upon himself. 7 tearings, 7 murders, 7 violent destructions, all snapping back into one tiny, shuddering piece of soul. By this interpretation, Voldemort's fate isn't just worse than death. It's the ultimate consequence of a lifetime spent harming himself in the pursuit of power. By trying to divide his soul to become immortal, he ensured that, in the end, every piece of what he'd destroyed would return to him, magnified, amplified, and utterly impossible to escape. It is a form of immortality, in a way, but the kind no one would ever choose. And on that light-hearted note, that's it for today's video. What do you think? Had you ever considered what happened to Voldemort after the books ended? Let me know down in the comment section below. Until next time, remember, it does not do to dwell on dreams and forget to live